Thank you so much, Tony. I was just quickly typing my own introduction into the chat. And a really warm welcome to everybody who is joining us today. My name is Sandy Starkweather. I'm at the University of Colorado, and I am serving as the executive director of the U.S. Arctic Observing Network and one of the co-leads of our risk management and hazard mitigation team. And so this is our team's speaker series. We are returning to our speaker series for the winter spring of 2026. Our series aims to connect the community engaged in developing tools and also data sets to support communities in Alaska affected by hazards and to identify opportunities in tools and data development to better work together as a community to solve these important problems. Um, I am joined also by a few of my team co-leads. They'll introduce themselves in the chat as well. Anna Liliadal, who is normally really the stalwart behind running this series, is ill, and so I am stepping in for her today to chair this meeting. But I know my co-leads will also step in and help support our discussion. So today, our presenter is Eric Mohrmann, an emergency management specialist with the Matanuska-Susitna Borough. Eric is going to share information on threat and hazard identification and risk assessment, which is also an acronym THIRA. And he's also going to explore the role of researchers, us being often a community that draws research interests together, explore the role of researchers in these assessments and subsequent emergency and mitigation plans. So he's going to particularly focus on low frequency, high hazard incidents. He'll highlight two recent research studies on low frequency, high hazard risks and the mitigation loop currently underway. So, with that, let's just all warmly welcome Eric. I know we've already covered the staying on mute during his presentation, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So, with that, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for allowing me to just meet with the group and provide some insight, hopefully, into the world of emergency management. I'm going to share my screen with you. And hopefully you should have at this point a screen in front of you with the title slide, which is the title of our presentation, the Hazard Identification Mitigation Feedback Loop. What the heck is that? From the emergency management perspective. So in the Matsu Borough, which is located just north of Anchorage, Alaska, our borough is the size of West Virginia. So we have a huge area with a population of about 117,000 people scattered throughout. Most of those are concentrated in the lower southern portion. We are, lack of a better term, blessed with a lot of potential hazards here, the normal ones faced by many communities, as well as some which are rather unique, such as volcano activity, for example. And of course, we're in the one of the highest seismic areas of the world along the Ring of Fire. So with that, let me and naturally run into a glitch right at the start. Excuse me just a second. I'll see if I can get this thing started now. There we go. So one of the things that we have found is that oftentimes there's a very important issues which are being studied by researchers in our area or that may affect our area, and we have no idea. We don't read the same journals that you do, and you obviously don't probably read the information that we have or go to the meetings that we do. And consequently, we end up with this communication gap, and some very important things can fall through that crack. So what the topic of this particular presentation is to identify, for the researcher to understand the hazard identification and mitigation feedback loop, which is used by emergency management not only in Alaska, but throughout the United States and through much of the rest of the world. And also, how do we cross communicate? How do we share information back and forth? How do we make those critical contacts? Uh, Understanding this process really helps in a synergistic fashion because the researchers may start the process, but they can provide us with critical information so that we can utilize that to develop our emergency plans and hopefully help mitigate some of those problems. And in turn, emergency management can support the researchers in their efforts, both verbally and for grant applications, but also help share that information with the public, which is, from the emergency management perspective, our customer. So trying to get the information from the researchers, get it in a format which the public can absorb and go from there has been very, very helpful projects that we've had with a number of researchers here in the borough. Main thing to remember is that we're all in the same boat. Uh, if you live in our area or if you're doing research in our area, what you do affects us, what we do affects you. So we've got to make sure that we're all paddling in the same direction. So we're going to start talking about that acronym THIRA. Emergency management loves acronyms. So what the heck is THIRA? Well, THIRA stands for the Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. What I'd like you as researchers to do is to think about your own research efforts and those items which may impact the community of the area that you're studying. What is the critical information that needs to get passed on to the local emergency managers or the local emergency planning committees? I'll explain that in a moment, which is going to affect that community so that we can take the steps necessary to make sure that our population is safe. So THIRA, that Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment, is a process. There's basically 3 steps to start with on this THIRA process. We have to identify the threats and hazards which are faced by that community. And as we'll see in a moment, some of those hazards may not be ones that the community can address, they have ability to address, or there may be some hazards which in fact may not even affect that community. And that leads us into the step 2, is once we've made a list of those threats, which are potential, we have to give some context to those threats. And then that goes to the third category, and what target capabilities or what objectives, what level do we want to reach where we can address and help take care of those, either from a response standpoint or a mitigation standpoint or a recovery standpoint. So those are the 3 steps of THIRA, and they lead into another process that we use. So let's look at those a little bit more closely. That first step, identify the threats and hazards. This is the list. And obviously that list is going to include things which happen frequently within the community. So for example, here in the Mat-Su Borough, we have frequent wildland fires. So they are definitely in our THIRA. We also have had cyber attacks, we've had earthquakes, we've had landslides, we've had avalanches. We have, because we're a major transportation hub for Alaska, we have rail, highway, even air going through our area. So we could have potential problems with that. And in fact, we have. So those are pretty easy to identify. They happened yesterday or last week or 2 years ago. So we have to address those. Other hazards are not so easy to identify. That's that low frequency type of hazard, which we may encounter, we may not even be aware of. When I'm talking about low frequency, I'm talking about decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years, all of those types of research issues, which you in the geophysical and geological research field may identify, or meteorological field may identify. That's the big one coming up, obviously, here. But we make a big long list. Now, if you remember, the second step that we go into is to give some content to that threats and hazards. And we may start with Well, let's divide them into natural hazards and human caused hazards. And we do have to identify those and address those. In fact, this last year, we have spent a copious amount of times with many agencies, police, EMS, fire, hospitals, school district, et cetera, developing response plans and mitigation plans um, for an active shooter incident in the school. Now you think, would you already have those in place? And in fact, we didn't. But we do now through this multiple organizational effort to come up with compatible response plans. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we did with those plans in just a moment. So we have natural, we have human cause. Well, that doesn't give us a great deal of information on the contents because ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to select which ones we're going to put our resources to address. So we do a little bit more of a risk assessment. And obviously, there are 3 questions here which were brought out, which are common in a risk assessment, but usually in the risk assessment, you have 15, 20, 40 questions, maybe even more. Well, let's, as an example, take a look at this. How often does a threat or hazard occur in a community? Is this something that happens frequently, in which case, or infrequently, or seldom? And what we're attempting to do here is take a subjective subject and put a numerical number on it to help us in our thinking in regards to how much of an impact is this threat or hazard going to have on our community. We may look at how extensive is the threat. For example, are a large number of people which are going to be affected by this thing, such as a wildland fire or a flood? Is it a small number of people that are going to be affected by this? What is an area that's going to be affected? Is it a large area in most of our community? Is it a small portion of our community? And how critical is that area? So if we have a wildland fire in Wasilla, Alaska, which is a city within our borough, that's one of the heavily populated areas, and we have a lot of homes. We have a lot of urban wildland interface issues. And obviously, the criticality of that area is very high, so we would get a higher score. If we were on the north slope of Alaska and we had hundreds and thousands of square miles of tundra, a wildland fire in that area isn't as critical. It's becoming more critical as we're finding out, thanks to our meteorological and climatological friends. But we let it burn. We don't even address it. Just let it go. It's not going to, there's nothing up there for it to harm. However, if it gets near a village or it gets near expensive timber area or something of that nature, now the criticality goes up. That makes sense. So, and also finally, what is the level of impact on this? If we have a hazmat spill which occurs in a unpopulated area that it's not going to spread, that's one issue. If that same hazmat spill occurs next to one of our many rivers, which provides drinking water, then that obviously is going to have a much higher potential impact. So this is just an example, but we would take these numbers and we would put it into a chart. What's the frequency, how extensive, the impact? This is a very simplified one. Usually we're looking at multiple pages and basically we add the numbers and that's what we come up with. So in this case, we frequently have wildland fires, so we gave it a 3. That's going to be pretty extensive. So 2.6 out of 3. The impact is going to be pretty high, 3. So our total is 8.6. For earthquakes, it's infrequent, but it can be very extensive, as we know from our 9.1 of 1964 or our 7.1 of 2018. The impact is very high, so it gets a 7. What about that asteroid strike? Well, it's potential, but what's the frequency? Extremely low. It's extensive and it has a very high impact. So from this, we can develop, and again, it's very subjective, an idea of where we want to put our resources to achieve the best benefit. And in fact, when we look at that asteroid strike, we have to think to ourselves, what are we gonna do about it? And the answer on the borough level is not much. We might do some sheltering, and some public notification, but that's gonna be about it. However, federal government may look at that and go, well, we have more resources. We need to do more monitoring on this thing and develop plans if it looks like an asteroid's gonna hit. So for them, they may put more of an emphasis on that asteroid strike. So once we've gone ahead and developed that list and gave it some context and came up with a numerical number, we have to start selecting targets on how we're going to address this thing. So we call these capability targets. So as an example, we want to say something like, excuse me for reading this, within 3 hours of an incident, provide emergency sheltering for 300 people, maintain the sheltering operations for 30 days. So when we establish these targets, which some folks or sometimes are called goals, sometimes are called objectives, we want to use a SMART acronym, which stands for it's very specific, it's measurable, it has action orientation, it's realistic. We can actually do this, and a time element's involved. Why time element? Because like everybody else in the world, we operate under deadlines. If we don't have a deadline, it doesn't get done. So consequently, we have to have a deadline to make sure that we are achieving it. And if we cannot achieve it within that deadline, then we need to look at how we need to modify our objectives in order to reach that specific goal. So in this case, once we have established a target capability, we do a stakeholder preparedness review. And the stakeholder preparedness review takes a look at what is our current capabilities. So let's go back to our sheltering example. We want to be able to shelter 300 people for a minimum of 30 days. If we look at our current capability and we find out that we have got a facility that can house 50 people for 30 days, and we have 50 beds and 50 sets of sheets and that sort of thing, then that's our current capability. So we've got to identify the gaps, pretty simplified again. We got to come up with 250 beds, 250 pillows, 250 sheets, and we need to make sure that facility has got the ability to provide sanitation, provide sleeping areas, provide emergency power, provide showers, provide all those other issues which are necessary in order to support those 300 people. Where did we get the number 300 from? Subjective. It may be that we looked in the past and said, what percentage of our population actually seeks congregate sheltering, as opposed to going to the neighbor's house or to their relatives, et cetera, and go from there. That's quite often the case. But we find those gaps, and once we've identified those gaps, we need to buy 250 cots, we need to buy 250 blankets, 250 pillows, we need to upgrade the restroom areas within our shelter, or we need to find a bigger shelter that has better restroom facilities, for example, or showers. Then we need to take those gaps, come up with a cost for that, and then take a look at our current funding capabilities, our resource capabilities, and identify where we have a gap and come up with a plan how we're going to close that gap. It could be that over the next 5 years, we're going to take 20% of the cost and use it to buy 20% of the materials and do 20% of the upgrades necessary to do that sheltering. It could be that we would look for grants. Now, that's one of the key things. The world runs on money, right? So we have to go through this process, the THIRA process and stakeholder preparedness review, in order to provide justification for grant applications. I'm sure as researchers that all of you have been involved in that process and you know how rigorous it is and how extensive you have to be on providing information. Information. Where does the information come from? Well, we've already identified that list of potential hazards. Most of those are provided, or the information on those are provided by you, the researchers. What about this area of identifying gaps? Absolutely. If we find gaps, and we use sheltering as an example, but let's say for example, we need to find meteorological instrumentation which is needed in a certain area, and that has a bearing upon how quickly tornadoes would be detected or something of that nature. Well, there's the gap. Where do we get the information? From you, the researchers. So you can see how critical your input in is on this process. So what about the emergency management activities itself? There's 4 activities that we get involved with, and it is a cycle, a never-ending circle that goes around and around. We start out with preparedness. And in preparedness, we start planning. Now, planning is taking all that information we've gathered from you, from history, from other sources. We look at other people's plans to see what's been generated before that might give us insight or ideas. And we start developing several types of plans. One is that THIRA, that is part of the planning. Another one is a hazard mitigation plan. How might we reduce the impact of that incident should it occur? And that we'll talk about mitigation a little bit more in the future. There's emergency response plans or emergency operation plans. In the borough, again, population isn't huge, but our emergency operation plan is some 550 pages long. So it addresses specific hazards as well as the general information necessary. And there's lots of appendices in there that we've managed to gather, appendices which have vital information that we've managed to gather and put in the plan so that we would have it if it's ever needed. An apt example is that we retrieved a lot of information from the Alaska Volcano Observatory in regards to volcanic ash and how that impacts our community. And that's incorporated within our response plan as how are we going to manage an ash fall on our community? And it's pretty extensive. So that goes into that appendix, which is attached to our emergency operation plan. So all these different plans are brought together. And the second thing we do is that we start training on those plans for our emergency responders, for our public works people, for our administrative people. We do training all the time. For example, we have what's called continuity of operation plans. That's another plan. And this is if this happens, if there's a volcanic eruption or an earthquake, how are you going to continue with your critical functions? What are your alternatives? And those all get into that COOP planning, and we train on that COOP planning. Or we may have our public works training with us on damage assessment. We may have our first responders, fire and EMS, in regards to the response for active shooter, for example, or for a wildland fire, etc. So all that training is ongoing all the time. And of course, the plans and training are modified by both real events, and we learn lessons from those, and also from exercises. So we conduct, because we don't want bad things to happen in our community, we train for those and we test those plans and test that training through exercises. Unfortunately, particularly here in the borough, it seems like we have plenty of real world events that also give us the insights on where we need to make corrections. And that is the purpose behind exercising, is to identify gaps in our planning, gaps in our training, gaps in our resources that we need to put back into that stakeholder review to identify those gaps and find a way to close them financially or through training, etc. Now, we have been extremely fortunate in that we have had a number of researchers from the geophysical, geological world, as well as from National Weather Service, NOAA, who have participated with us in the exercises. And the exercises, when they have that participation from the scientists that are finding this information and gathering this information for us, brings a reality to it. Exercise is like a play. And if we can make it as real as possible, that would make the lessons that we learned from the exercise and the improvement plan that we get from the exercise that much more valid and specific towards that particular threat. So having reached out to them and having them participate with us on the exercises has been a tremendous amount of help. It's also extremely good opportunity for us to educate our responders, our administration, and the public in regards to potential hazards that we face and what some of the ramifications may be. Participation in exercise is really beneficial, and we appreciate all the efforts that our researchers have done. I'll mention that a little bit later on as well. So after the preparedness portion comes that response. The incident happens. Now we have to take all of the things that we have learned, all the resources that we have gathered, and we need to take immediate actions to help those who are in need, to help save property, to protect the environment, as well as to save lives. Recovery. The recovery phase is the next part of emergency management, but it doesn't begin after response. It actually begins in the preparedness phase. We need to start making plans on how we would recover. How would we bring the community back to normal, restoring the critical infrastructure, rebuilding it. Part of this is identifying what are those critical structures. It could be a water treatment plant. It could be a hospital. It could be a residential area. For many of our small Alaskan villages, it could be the school. If they lose the school, that is the hub of their community, and that is a major disaster. The larger jurisdictions, such as the boroughs, if we lost the school, we can transition to other schools quite easily. So you can see that the level of a disaster is going to vary depending upon the size of the community. How critical is that piece of infrastructure? So the recovery phase begins with that planning. What are we going to do if? We here in emergency management always think about what's the worst thing that can happen. And then we use our imagination to describe that, and we hope it never occurs, but that's what we plan for, the worst that can happen. It goes through the response phase because we may want to take actions during the response phase to prevent additional damage. So let's take that example of the water treatment plant. If we had a hazmat spill, definitely what we want to do is shut down the water intake if the hazmat spill happened to occur in the water source for that water treatment plant. Protect that water treatment plant. That's part of the recovery. And then there's mitigation. So that mitigation is there to prevent or reduce the impact of future emergencies. And in places where there are coastal communities which are subject to hurricanes, such as Western Alaska, they have found that down in Florida and areas of that nature, it's necessary to raise structures up above the high water mark, which is historically found. So again, that gets back into that research. What was the high water mark? What is the tidal surge which may occur? Is it in a floodplain where we get into locating floodplains by LIDAR and things of that nature? So by taking actions where we can raise those structures or move those structures, or in some cases, we've been involved with that, we just buy out the structure, tear it down, and return it back to nature. All of those mitigation activities are identified by what occurred in previous events or what could occur in future events based on your research. So another example of mitigation could be a flood. We've oftentimes found that floods may occur because culverts are too small. So mitigation activities are dig up the road and put in a bigger culvert so that the water can drain. Those are those issues which we identify and work towards. Now, one of the big things about this is where are we going to get the money? Mitigations are activities are usually pretty darn expensive. Well, most mitigation grants, where most of this money is going to come from, is based upon that community THIRA, which we just discussed, and the capability gaps that we have discussed and identified. They are also based upon uh, those gaps which are proven through those planning, response, and exercises. So if we identify those gaps during an exercise, for example, before the incident really occurs, we can apply for mitigation grants for that. Now, FEMA usually reserves 7.5 to 20% of disaster response funds. So let's say, for example, there is a major flood which occurs in an area. If a disaster is declared by the local jurisdiction to the state because it exceeds their abilities to manage that disaster, and the state uses their resources to help manage what it exceeds their capabilities, then a presidential disaster declaration is requested. And if the presidential disaster cabinet agrees, advises the president, and the president agrees that yes, we are going to call this a disaster and declare it a disaster, that releases funds from FEMA for recovery efforts primarily. Although they do provide in very large instances a lot of hands-on physical resources immediately. Oftentimes it's a checkbook, and it's up to the state and local governments to handle it with some assistance, oftentimes from planning groups which come in to specifically address it. So those disaster funds which are there, 7.5 to 20% of that response cost is reserved for mitigation projects. Those mitigation projects can include a variety of things. They don't have to be related to that particular disaster. So let's say that we had a major wildland fire disaster. There was a lot of money that was generated by FEMA for the disaster response to that. And there's this pocket of money that's left behind. Mitigation projects usually within the state or within the region, can apply for that money, but it doesn't have to be related to wildland fires. It could be related to another capability gap that a community has identified. And that wildland fire doesn't have to occur within the Matanuska-Susitna Borough. We shorten it a little bit in order for us to apply for the funds for the gaps that we have identified. Now, we're not sure exactly what's going to occur in the future with that, but we do know this. Justification for the grants is rigorously required. They have requirements for a huge amount of information, and that information is used to justify that particular project. They have to do a cost benefit analysis, and we have to be involved with that. Where do we get some of that information? Guess who? That's you, the researchers, as well as our local information that we have. So all of those mitigation grants are quite important. You are essential in that process. One thing to think about, you look for research grants in order to conduct your efforts. I'm glad you have an inquiring mind because that's what's necessary. Can emergency management assist you on those grants? Well, if you can demonstrate on your grants that, yes, this is going to explore an issue that can affect local population, you get support from your local emergency management, do you think that might help make your grant application more likely to receive funding? I would think so. I know we certainly rely on you, and there's no reason why you couldn't rely on us. I'll discuss that in just a moment on a couple of projects that we actually have underway. So let's look at a couple of real world issues here in the Matsu Borough. Again, we like to shorten that because it's so darn long. Start with tsunami. In 1964, you probably recall there was a 9.1 Richter earthquake resulted in a devastating tsunami as well as the earthquake damage. And that tsunami killed 139 people and destroyed numerous communities, wiped Valdez off the face of the earth, basically. A huge amount of damage to a lot of areas. Well, how did that affect the Matsu Borough? Well, in the Matsu Borough, we had no tsunami damage. There's a huge tsunami wave. Nothing happened here. So consequently, we believe that tsunamis can't propagate up the Cook Inlet because of the shallow waters. There's no hazard to our borough. So is the tsunami included in our THIRA? Absolutely not. It's sort of like that asteroid strike. Not going to affect us, so big deal. Well, what we didn't know until just a couple of years ago, from 1964 up until a couple of years ago, 2023, some modeling was done and historical research indicated that the 1964 earthquake occurred at low tide in the Cook Inlet. We normally have a 30-foot high tide in the Cook Inlet. That's normal. So when the tsunami came up, that was 30 feet and 4 inches in height. It arrived at low tide in the dark, and nobody even noticed because it's only 4 inches above the high tide mark. Big deal. So we always assume tsunamis can't affect us. Yes, they can. We found out 2023 because inquiring minds asked the question, when did the tsunami reach the Matsu Borough? And in fact, they found out that if that same issue had occurred at high tide, we would have a tsunami which would top our high tide mark by 30 feet and 4 inches. So, thanks to the assistance of Dr. Suleiman and Dr. Nikolsky with the Alaska Earthquake Center and Dr. Salisbury of the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys and their crews, we had this mapping, which was conducted using LIDAR and information. The red area means that we've got 7 meters plus of water. And thanks to their efforts, because they brought that to our attention, as well as conducted uh, uh, meetings, informational sharing meetings throughout the Matsu Borough, as well as down through Kenai and Anchorage, we all discovered that, by golly, we do have a potential for a tsunami problem here. But what did we do about it on a local level? Well, first actions I mentioned, we had the presentations that were made by Dr. Suleiman, Salisbury, Nikolsky, and their staff. They came to our emergency operations center and advised us and shared this information with us. We identified subdivisions which were located in the inundation zone based on their mapping. Guess what? Tsunamis are now part of the borough's THIRA because now some 40 years, 40, almost 50 years later, we identified, yes, this could happen. This is one of those high risk, low frequency events. Not only do we have a few subdivisions which can be impacted by this, but the Glen Highway, the major thoroughfare for the state of Alaska, runs right through this area. In the 1964 quake, an area called Hay Flats sank 6 feet. This area is also projected to be inundated 20 some feet above the roadway by a tsunami. We have 50,000 people per day travel back and forth commuting to Anchorage from the Matsu Valley on that road. 95% of all goods imported into Alaska come through the port of Alaska, and all that material which goes up to the interior, to Fairbanks, to our community here at Matsu, comes up that highway or the adjacent railway line. Suddenly, we're looking at This may be low frequency, but is this a potential high risk? And is it in critical infrastructure? And the answer obviously is yes, it certainly is. So it was added to our THIRA. We develop a response plan. What are we going to do? Who are we going to contact? Who's going to be in charge of this thing? How would we get people out? How would we notify the subdivisions which are at risk, etc.?
And
We
Eric,
created
this is Tony. If I just want to pop in real quick, I just want to do a quick time check. We're about 45 minutes in, and I know you want to finish the slide and you've got one other example, but maybe we could use the next like a couple minutes for those. And I just want to make sure we have time for some Q&A, but I'll let you finish this up.
I apologize for that. I got much too verbose.
No problem. Yeah, but if you want to take another just like couple minutes,
Okay,
I
very
know
good.
you've got a little more on this slide.
I'll try and move this along. Okay, so basically we identified the problems and we identified that it would be good to have audible devices in these areas, as well as our other normal methods of notifying the public. We applied for hazard mitigation and for $800,000 to install such audible devices, and that was accepted by FEMA. Currently, we're in the design phase of that, and we're going to be installing those over the next couple of years. One of the other ones that came up was Dr. Higman and his crew. I won't go through all of their names, but Dr. Higman with Ground Truth Alaska did some research along with colleagues on an international basis into an area on the flank of Sheep Mountain near Glacier View, Alaska. They did LiDAR studies and such and found that a major portion of the Sheep Mountain is moving and threatens to cause a landslide over the Glen Highway, across several businesses, and into what's called the Matanuska River Narrows. So this is a diagram which Dr. Higman and his crew put together and provided for the public. Basically, this large portion of mountain that you see in the gray is sitting on very unstable bedrock, and has shown evidence of slides in the past, as well as geological evidence that there are permafrost problems associated with this, and a potential for a major slide could occur again. In fact, this is one of the highest in Alaska. This particular graphic that they provided is the one that really comes to my attention because it very clearly shows from the LiDAR study what's posed over top of it. That little narrow ribbon you see on the bottom is the Glen Highway that has 700 to 1,700 vehicles per day go across it. There's about 30 different structures in the area. And if you look at the bottom of this, you'll see that there is a canyon-like effect where the Matanuska River goes through. Some of our very brief looks at this thing with Dr. Higman and his crew show some potential ramifications. Of course, death and injury and destruction. This thing slides. Closing of the Glen Highway for weeks, months, maybe permanently. Creation of a landslide dammed lake, which could potentially dam up to 60 million cubic feet of water. A potential for a catastrophic release of that dammed water, and a huge flash flood, which would affect our communities of Chickaloon, Sutton, Palmer, and Butte. Massive erosion along those riverbanks. And of course, sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, houses firing. So what did we do? Well, Dr. Higman and his colleagues held public meetings. That's where we found out about it. The threat was added to our THIRA. We have emergency operation plans for landslide, which we've revised. We've done tabletop exercises that were held for first responders and also for department heads for that COOP planning. Dr. Higman did participate and was extremely helpful on both of those. We've revised our continuity of operation plans, and we are seeking mitigation grants for the monitoring of that landslide potential. So we don't have any monitoring equipment in there currently. We're going to be looking for funding in order to establish that. So what can you do? Contact the local emergency management or local emergency planning committees and tell them of your research. Let's share that information. My daughter has a doctorate in ecology. She works for the forestry department. I have no idea what she says on her research reports. But if you can dumb it down and let us in the emergency management know the outline of it, it's extremely helpful. If applicable, if it affects the state of Alaska, the Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management also should be advised of what this may be. They handle the entire statewide area as opposed to the borough, which is very local. Participate in those public presentations, laptop and functional exercises. Your assistance makes a world of difference on how valid those may be. And work with us to help us and help yourself find those funding to do further research and mitigation efforts. Thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to run over.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And I see people are already starting to show their appreciation for your fantastic comprehensive overview. That was really wonderful. I dropped a note in the chat if we're going to take this time for Q&A. And so you can either raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. Tony and I, between ourselves, will be monitoring the chat. Is there anybody who would like to um, follow up Eric's presentation with a question?
And I
And
know,
yeah, I see one question in the chat from Anna. Could you clarify at what time a researcher should contact you if they discover something?
Probably the earlier the better. Dr. Higman's research, as an example, he has not completed a lot. He is still working on doing some modeling, which is going to provide some additional information. I think he did about a year's worth of research before he made the initial contact with us. And he, in fact, was also assisted with that by the local community at Glacier View, who provided transportation resources and other types of resources to facilitate his research. That's something that emergency management may be able to help out as well, because we've got resources that may be able to help you with your research. Come talk to us, see what we can do to help each other. But the earlier is the better. I would make one caution. We had the Redoubt volcano, looked like it was going to erupt. The Alaska Volcano Observatory very correctly made that information and response information available to the public. But they did work with us emergency managers where we were able to say, well, maybe we want to address it in this fashion as opposed to other fashion in order to maintain the community's confidence, but not get the community too concerned, because we're used to people getting really excited and we want them to be informed, but we don't want them to get terribly worried, if that makes sense. So that collaboration was very helpful.
Great, thank you. We note also Rosemary had some interventions in the chat earlier during your discussion. So Rosemary, if you would like to come off mute and pose a question for our speaker, and then we also see a question from Lee Erickson in the chat. Rosemary, if you prefer not, that's fine as well. Okay, well, so I can also just read. I see Rosemary had a specific question that was, how do we get the process to allow community inform? How do we get to the process to allow community informed response?
Again, best thing is contact the local emergency management. Most places that have got a larger population the Fairbanks, for example, the Denali Borough, Matsu Borough, places like that in Alaska, or if you're in the lower 48, most places have an emergency manager. If not, they probably have what's called a local emergency planning committee. Those were developed after 1984 Bhopal chemical disaster that killed 20,000 people in India. And the local emergency planning committees are there, and they're all hazard. Almost all jurisdictions have one. And if you contact them, they contact the local city manager or the borough manager office or administration and ask, who should I talk to? And that probably would go to the LEPC. Their task is to approve emergency plans, look at potential disasters, come up with ideas of how they're going to address those things, and keep the public informed. Once you make that connection, we have resources to reach out to the public, to talk to them. We know the media, we have our own media availability, etc. And we'd be happy to work with you to try and get some of that information that's out there. If you're in a very small area, like some of the coastal communities in Alaska, take a look at the tribal organizations to see if they have emergency management or emergency responders that you can chat with. The local fire chief might be a person to contact. And in any case, the state of Alaska Department of Veteran Affairs, Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management is there to represent the entire state of Alaska. And they can assist you in getting information out to the public as well as coordinating with the local emergency managers. They know who to talk to. If you are in other states other than Alaska, there is Region 10, which is in Bothell, Washington, FEMA. Currently, they're closed down, but they're an excellent source on getting information. Or you can just pick up the phone and call the local administration in the area that you're doing your research in and say, who do I talk to? But reaching out like that starts that communication pathway.
Fantastic. Thank you for such a thorough answer. And it looks like Lee passes her thanks along too, that also addressed her question about who to contact for the tools that USGS is working on mapping future flood hazards. We have a few more minutes before the top of the hour. Tony said she can stay on a bit longer if there are further questions. Did anybody else want to? Um, Eric, I'll push a question your way from the area that we concern ourselves with quite a bit, which is you had mentioned I'm particularly interested in the what you had described as the rigorous needs for mitigation grants in terms of data and information. Is there, could you characterize what the largest data gaps are that you're confronted with when you're trying to apply for these mitigation funds and what resources you turn to for data? Like, are there key resources in the state where you turn where we could maybe be better networking around data availability?
Um, because we have a wide variety of hazards, that's kind of a very large open-ended question, but let's take it from a geophysical or type of standpoint. Obviously, LiDAR studies or mapping studies, what are the potentials? We have to show, for example, what is the potential impact of an incident so that we can justify our request. Let's say, for example, the the example that I gave you of the landslide potential with the potential damming. What that's kind of like back of the napkin right at the moment is the best guess, but what type of modeling might be available in order to actually provide more rigorous scientific evidence that yes, these are the potentials. That sort of information would go a long ways towards a mitigation grant application. For example, if we wanted to look at construction of groins or dikes of some kind in order to prevent a flood of a critical area. Well, we have to have LiDAR studies, we have to have inundation studies based upon certain criteria that uh, of potential dam release. Okay, which gets back into what is the quantity of the water that might be backed up behind the dam? What is the depth? What are the flow rates? What are the expected um, uh, uh, rates of travel of water release, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That all gets back into your guys's backyard as opposed to ours. We don't know how to do that. We don't have that information. So we rely upon you to provide us with that information. So we would look for that. And it's not uncommon for us to contact the National Weather Service and say, what if? Another example is that when readout looked like it was going to erupt, the National Weather Service provided us with a daily update from winds aloft and where the ash cloud was likely to go and what was the quantity of ash that was likely to be dropped. So that research information is critical to our response plans. Is it going to affect us or isn't it? What do we tell the public that's based upon that sort of research?
Great. Thank you so much for that response. I see there's a few other comments in the chat from Anna about the sort of pragmatic approach of approaching people like Eric directly when you have regional insights from your science rather than maybe going via the statewide level and hoping that information trickles down. And then also a comment from Ann Garland about certainly the importance of this networking, such as we're doing here in this space. And I can see from how long people have stayed past the top of the hour that people are really hungry for conversations like this, and it really exemplifies what IARPA collaborations can do in terms of building some of these bridges and putting practitioners and scientists in closer communication with each other. This might be a good point to turn the floor back over to Tony, who maybe can introduce anything about the future plans for our series. And for us to all thank Eric again for such a compelling presentation to give us so much to think about and to motivate the kinds of interactions that can help make great use of our science. So thank you so much, Eric. Much appreciated.
Well, I certainly appreciate all that you do. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would just echo thank you, Eric, for that fantastic presentation and for dedicating your time to be here today. And for, I don't even know if we told you, sort of re-kicking off this Risk Speaker series of ours. So you are our first of the year. So thank you also for breaking ground in that way. I guess just in closing, I would let everyone know that we do have another meeting in this series next week on Thursday, same time slot. So that's the 26th. I put the title and event link in the chat. So invites will go out pretty shortly after this. We've got someone from the Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities going to be speaking a little bit about the typhoon response and some of the tools that were used. So we hope to see you all there again. I'll send an invite to Risks, several other teams and communities right after this. But again, thank you to Eric. Thank you everyone for being here. This was a fantastic conversation and hopefully more to come from here.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone.